بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
After nearly a decade of war between the Greeks and the Trojans, the Greeks offered the Trojans a giant wooden horse as a parting gift. However, a Trojan priest suspected that there was something dangerous hidden in the horse, so he protested to his fellow Trojans, "Do not trust the horse, Trojans. Fear the Greeks, even when bringing gifts." The gift that the Muslim world received from the Greeks will be the focus of this video. The gift is referred to as Ilm Al-Kalam, or speculative theology, a largely Greek import. Ibn Khaldun's definition of speculative theology is a common reference point. He defines speculative theology as a science that involves arguing with logical proofs in defense of articles of faith and refuting innovators who deviate from the established tenets of the Islamic creed. Metaphorically, speculative theology is akin to the wooden horse that the Greeks gifted to the Trojans. Just like the wooden horse, speculative theology was captivating. Its form and design represented the peak of human ingenuity. One could not deny its apparent magnificence. Perhaps this is why Muslims went to great efforts to purify speculative theology from its polytheistic and cultural origins, such as the changing of the name God Zeus to Al-Ilah, and moderating the excesses of Greek and Persian philosophy. Also, they borrowed the arguments of the Hellenized Jews and Christians by alleging that the foundations of Greek philosophy were laid by the ancient prophetic civilizations, or that the Greeks existed in a time between prophets, so they were excused for their lack of monotheism. Invoking these narratives appears to be an attempt to cover up the embarrassment of adopting Greek and Persian philosophy. Their embarrassment was understandable. They had to justify that the Islamic articles of faith needed to be defended by Greek texts developed in polytheistic societies that only came to the Muslim world through the mass translation efforts of Christians. Ironically, much of Christendom had left these texts to decay for centuries due to their polytheistic origins, yet there did not seem to be much apprehension in translating these texts for the Muslim elites. What is most puzzling is that the Greek texts were adopted in spite of the consistent and significant opposition from the main Islamic luminaries of that period. Just as the Trojan priest warned the Trojans, Ahlul Hadith warned the Muslims, "Do not be deceived by this gift." They pleaded to their fellow Muslims that the Quran and Sunnah were a sufficient source of guidance and defense. In spite of all of this, the wooden horse was just too alluring, too captivating, too mesmerizing to turn away from, so they accepted the gift with open arms. According to the myth, the Greeks had hidden elite soldiers inside the wooden horse. At night, when all was quiet, the soldiers crept out of the horse and opened the gates for the rest of the Greek army to decimate the Trojans. Likewise, there is something dangerous hidden inside speculative theology. Ibn Khaldun gives us a hint as to what could be hidden inside speculative theology. He observed that philosophy had been interwoven with speculative theology to the extent that it is difficult to separate one from another. Likewise, Ibn Khaldun's contemporary At-Taftazani made a similar observation. At-Taftazani observed that when philosophy was first translated into Arabic, some Muslims submerged themselves into the field of philosophy in order to refute the philosophers. But in doing so, they precipitated a marriage between speculative theology and philosophy to the extent that speculative theology could not be totally distinguished from philosophy. The only difference being, speculative theology will have within it Qala Allah or Qala Rasulullah. This notion of philosophy that we refer to is a system of inquiry rooted in the principal sources of Aristotelian natural science and Neoplatonic speculation. What is most important here is that Ibn Khaldun and At-Taftazani were writing in the 14th century. By this time, we were led to believe that speculative theology had been totally decontaminated from its philosophical root. Unfortunately, this is an impossible task. So what we are left with is a powerful technology. I refer to speculative theology as a powerful technology because it causes certain behaviors and thought patterns in whoever uses it. I believe that individuals are profoundly unaware of the power of this technology. Many believe that they are using the technology for a perceived benefit, but actually, this technology is using them. Equally, we may believe that we are using our smartphone for a perceived benefit, but perhaps our smartphones are using us. Metaphorically, this point is made in this interview with a video games designer. The interviewer assumes that the individual that plays a video game controls the video game. The game designer rebuts this point.
Who's playing who here? Are you pressing the buttons or is the game pressing your buttons? Really, the programmer is pressing your buttons. He's already proscribed all of the moves here. He's set the thing up. It's he who's playing you, and it's him who's manipulating your movement. So to believe that this is true interactivity, or meta design, where you yourself are controlling the outcome, is a little bit naive, really. You are an innocent in this.
Just as points, levels, and reward systems are used to incentivize video game players to behave in certain ways, speculative theology prompts certain behaviors and thought patterns. Many are painfully unaware where the path of speculative theology will take them. I stress that I am referring exclusively to speculative theology, which is an organized system of inquiry rooted in the principal sources of Aristotelian natural science and Neoplatonic speculation. I am not including generic rational arguments or appeals to common sense or generic arguments to prove the absurdity of an issue. Not this. There is something unique about this very Eurocentric, organized mode of inquiring into the nature of God that impacts the ontology and epistemology of its users. It is such a powerful technology that even when one's intention is to refute it or to uncover its mysteries, he runs the risk of being weakened by it. It was reported that Sheikhuna Abu Hamid دخل في بطون الفلاسفة ثم أراد أن يخرج منهم فما قدر. Terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. This video posits that whoever engages with speculative theology runs the risk of falling victim to the dialectic voice, manufactured complexity, embracing the myth of the noble savage, and disputation. We are left defenseless as the hidden army under the cover of darkness creeps out of the wooden horse. Perhaps the main problem is that speculative theology works too well. If one is trained very well, he will obliterate the foundations of his opponent. But in doing so, he may obliterate his own foundations. It is almost like a man that learns to kindle a fire, to torch the doctrines of his opponents. But this fire is not easily controlled. It may in fact scorch his own doctrines. Few men can tame this fire. We have seen the damage of these self-ignited fires. Matters that were once definite now become possible. Issues that were black and white, they are now shades of grey. The affirmation of the names and attributes of Allah now becomes a point of contention. And also the content of some prophetic narrations may no longer sit well. Speculative theology encourages a second voice in our head. We can call this voice a dialectic voice that pushes the individual towards non-committal. He cannot fully commit or positively affirm an issue because he is concerned with the possible rebuttal from an imagined opponent in his head. For example, he believes that if he affirms a particular statement, which he believes to be true, he will now become vulnerable to a rebuttal. So he refrains from affirmation, or he only talks in a vague manner. Essentially, there is a second voice living in our head rent-free that dictates what truths to reveal and what truths to conceal. Instead of speaking to your truth, speculative theology compels you to speak with strategy. Once you open the door to the dialectic voice, there is no telling where it may lead you. It may take you down a path where your Lord becomes more and more inaccessible, more vague, more unknowable, until eventually you believe that there is nothing over the throne. This is because the dialectic voice liberates the inquisitive mind. Your mind is now unshackled, unlocked, and you begin to question that which should not be questioned. It compels you to question areas where there is no revelation to provide an answer. Who is to say that this dialectic voice in our heads is our voice? Is it really our voice? Or maybe by unlocking our mind, we have invited an enemy to enter through the front door. Satan will come to one of you and say, "Who created this? Who created that?" Until he says to him, "Who created your Lord?" When it comes to this, let him seek refuge in Allah and stop such thoughts. Speculative theology encourages the user to manufacture complexity, meaning The user overcomplicates matters that were once simple. This is not always done out of malice. Sometimes it is well-intentioned, but how many intend good, but never actually achieve it? It is just like writing a sentence and adding more and more words in a genuine effort to make ourselves clear, but we inadvertently cause confusion, and what we say becomes harder to follow. Likewise, much of speculative theology overcomplicates what is simple by diluting the words of Allah with the words of man. It adds distance to that which was near, and it mystifies what was clear. We as humans, if left to our own devices, mystify that which is clear and delve into abstraction for no apparent benefit. Such overcomplication occurs when we step away from revelation. The more we substitute divine words with our words, the more complex things become. Very subtly, speculative theology takes the user away from revelation towards the intricacies of human reasoning. It is a powerful technology. Even when one is refuting or exposing speculative theology, he too drifts away from revelation. This is not to say that everything in our religion is simple or understandable to the layperson. For example, the sciences that maintain the integrity of the religion are not for everyone. But knowing our Lord should not require proficiency in speculative theology. Curiously, this manufactured complexity is something that is revered by those that engage in speculative theology. It is a badge of honor. It is a means to distinguish them from the common people. It is a way to distinguish them from the hashawiyah. Speculative theology is positioned as a highly cultured intellectual activity that distinguishes one class of people from another. You may notice this trait when they address individuals who are not conversant with speculative theology. Observe the patronizing language and condescending body language. Observe which Islamic texts are valued. You will notice the priority given to texts that attempt to understand issues in rational terms, whereas there is significantly less value given to texts that are concerned with understanding issues through the lens of the Quran and Sunnah. Speculative theology has always embodied this distinction between popular beliefs and the beliefs of the elite. Popular beliefs are viewed as crude, accessible, simplistic, surface level, overly rule-based systems. In complete contrast, the elite who utilize speculative theology are able to conceive abstract ideas. They alone can reach what is inaccessible to the masses. They alone can understand the immaterial world in rational terms. This is why we saw Greek and Persian philosophers share the same polytheistic religion as their countrymen. However, they claim that their countrymen practice a crude and vulgar form of polytheism, while they claim that they practice the more abstract, interpretive, and esoteric form of polytheism. Likewise, in Muslim societies, we find that those that engage in speculative theology claim to practice a more enlightened, interpretive, and rational form of Islam that differs from the common people's more crude, literalist, and anthropomorphic version of Islam. We see this sentiment again and again in their writing. They allege that the Quranic verses that state Allah is above us and that He has certain attributes is for the benefit of the common people. Allah had to appeal to their limited intellects with anthropomorphic and relatable terms. If not, the common people would not have believed in Him. However, the elites do not need to resort to such crude interpretations. They have been endowed with a greater capacity to interpret Allah's names and attributes in a more enlightened manner. Speculative theology inadvertently projects the myth of the noble savage onto the first generations of Muslims. Through the prism of this myth, the first generations of Muslims are seen as ahistorical and mythic. When we read between the lines of speculative theology, we start to see that the treatment of the first generations of Muslims is very similar to the Eurocentric myth of the noble savage. This myth is developed by groups that believe that they have reached intellectual maturity, which surpasses their forerunners. Consequently, they view their forerunners as noble savages who lived in a state of nature. They were untouched by the compromises of civilization. They were simple-minded and innocent to the ways of the world. They thought and acted by natural reason alone, and that was enough for them. The term savage was not initially wholly negative. Savage originally signified being wild, like a wildflower, or being untamed, undomesticated. This myth of the noble savage comes from the Enlightenment period to explain why some groups of people were left behind and why such groups of people did not achieve the same level of European intellectual development. Likewise, those that utilize speculative theology are compelled to view the first generations of Muslims as noble savages because they need to reconcile the fact that the early Muslims did not engage in philosophical debate. They would have to concede that the interior and exterior of speculative theology would be unrecognizable, unrelatable, and unusable to the early Muslims. More importantly, they needed the myth of the noble savage to reconcile this conundrum. If speculative theology is essential, then why did we not see the best generations of Muslims integrate Greek and Persian texts into their theology? Moreover, why did the best generations of Muslims explicitly shun these texts, burn these texts, drown these texts, bury these texts? All the conditions were there for them to develop speculative theology. It would have been advantageous for the early Muslims to utilize these foreign philosophies. Muslims were surrounded by the great centers of learning that grew larger and larger with the influx of philosophers fleeing persecution from the Christianized Roman Empire. Moreover, they also encountered cultured and literate Hellenized Jews, Christians, and heretics that were well versed in defending their beliefs. They were materially less developed than these great civilizations that engulfed them. Yet, we see multiple accounts of their explicit rejection of foreign religious ideas and concepts. This rejection needs to be explained. It needs to be reconciled. Enter the myth of the noble savage. The early Muslims were noble savages that did not need these foreign sciences because they lived in a state of nature. They were pure souls. They thought and acted by natural reason alone, and that was enough for them. They were just simple folk. They did not have a full understanding of the magnificence and usefulness of these foreign texts, or they did not have the intellectual capacity or the wherewithal to distinguish between the beneficial and unfavorable aspects of speculative theology. From another angle, the myth of the noble savage is useful to explain why the Prophet ﷺ needed to use simplistic language to describe the attributes of Allah. For example, in reaction to a companion reciting a Quranic verse that mentioned Allah hearing and seeing all things, the Prophet ﷺ placed his thumb on his ear to indicate Allah's hearing, and he placed his finger on his eye to indicate Allah's seeing. According to their myth, the Prophet was enlightened and exceptional, but he was surrounded by simple folk. He needed to use crude and anthropomorphic language to appeal to their sensibilities. Ultimately, viewing the first generations of Muslims through the prism of the noble savage reveals itself in two matters. Firstly, there is a reluctance to extract a methodology from these early generations. All sorts of excuses are put forward. But ultimately, this reluctance signifies the lack of value placed on the scholarship of this early period. So when it is said to them that you should refrain from a particular religious act because this act was not performed by the companions nor the subsequent generations, even though they all had the capacity to do this act, we are usually met with indifference. It simply does not matter what the early Muslims did or did not do. From engaging in speculative theology to celebrating the birthday of the Prophet, there is little to no concern of whether these acts originated with the early Muslims. Moreover, they would consider it irrational that anyone would ascribe themselves to the Salaf or to the first generations because scholarship has massively evolved since this period. More advanced systems of theology have been established. So why would you want to link yourself to such a sparse, crude, and underdeveloped period? That natural period has gone. The natural state of the first Muslims is no longer attainable. Thus, they will feel far more comfortable ascribing themselves to individuals that came after the first three generations. What is behind all of this is that extracting the methodology from the first generations would be extremely difficult for the rationalist schools of thought because they are likely to encounter multiple narrations that oppose their creedal systems. Second, the first generations of Muslims are treated as malleable. They can be bent and distorted to suit a particular need. They talk on behalf of the first generations of Muslims as if they had no voice of their own, perhaps because they believed that they reached such a high intellectual level that they are able to explain simplistic behaviors of the first generations. Just like Robinson Crusoe, who speaks on behalf of the savage Friday. Friday essentially has no voice. His story is told through Crusoe's narrative. We see this clearly when the statements and actions of the first Muslims explicitly oppose positions held in speculative theology. They are promptly explained away and dismissed. Would it be too hard to envision that the statements and actions of the first Muslims came from a place of discernment, study, and deliberation rather than just nature? Using speculative theology in the propagation of Islam or even creedal matters pivots you towards disputation, towards conflict, towards dispute. It sets you on a war footing. What is potentially a friendly discussion turns into a contest. This is not surprising given speculative theology's historical roots in Christian apologetics. Well before the advent of Islam, Christians weaponized Greek philosophy to defend their doctrines in accordance to reason and logic. For the most part, these philosophies will end up in the hands of the Muslims. The fact that speculative theology was utilized by non-Muslims to defend their doctrines indicates that it is not a means to bring us closer to the truth. Instead, it is designed for argumentation. It is designed for defense, not discovery. We can see the impact of such argumentation on the dawah scene. It transforms dawah from an act of worship into a contest, from a religious duty into a competition, from a merciful act into entertainment. It is now a spectacle. It is akin to watching a wrestling match or a chess game. Neither party seems to have any interest in the truth. Instead, the focus is on how to outwit or outmaneuver one's opponent in full public display. To be fair, we cannot place all the blame on speculative theology. There are several other factors, such as social media algorithms, ego, and monetary rewards. Whatever the cause, what happened to having an authentic conversation? What happened to wanting the best for those that disagree with you? What happened to talking to a fellow human being without a pre-written script of logical models? Why do we sound like this?
So my favorite argument for God's existence is that I believe in free will. Okay, the reason that I think this is an argument for God's existence is because if you believe that human beings are essentially just balls of meat wandering around aimlessly in the universe, the kind of Spinoza's stone that thinks that it was moving of its own accord but actually was thrown, if you believe that and you don't believe in free will, then there's an internal coherence and logic to it. If you believe that you have the ability to make independent choices, that you can actually supersede your own biological drives and the environment around you to any extent, even to the smallest extent, this means that you believe in something that can't actually be proved by science, but that you are living every single day.
In all seriousness, this may be because speculative theology is effective in appealing to the intellect, but the intellect is limited. It can only go so far. Speculative theology is not particularly effective. It barely reaches the heart. A key feature of the confrontational nature of speculative theology is its presentation of very rigid dichotomies. Either you agree with me, which is the normal and rational choice, or you are on the side of absurdity or abnormality. This type of propositioning places individuals in a corner where they are compelled to choose between options. This may be acceptable in some circumstances. However, when Muslims turn this dichotomy approach toward their fellow Muslims, they in fact turn their weapons toward the Muslims that they disagree with. It is troubling how swiftly these weapons that were used to defend the faith are turned back on the Muslims who raise a legitimate concern. I guess what we do outside of our house has a way of impacting what happens inside our house. There are some disagreements that cannot be parceled into these man-made dichotomies. For example, two people may have a disagreement about using speculative theology. When one of them informs the other about the tradition of refraining from speculative theology, the other person's defense mechanism is triggered, causing them to put a dichotomy forward. We can either appeal to the rationality of non-Muslims by using speculative theology, or we can tell them to convert to Islam because the Quran said so. Now one is compelled to make a choice. They have been cornered. They have been placed in a straitjacket. They have little choice but to choose the more rational option, not necessarily the most truthful option. There is a difference here. The truth is often beyond dichotomies. It cannot be neatly contained in these man-made constructs. Moreover, one's rationality is not easily separated from one's preference. All sorts of rational reasons can be conjured up to justify one's preference, but the truth may go against one's preference and by extension, one's rationality. By using such dichotomies, you create an ontological and epistemological divide between you and your brother, because you demand that he adopts the most rational choice, but he demands that you adhere to the traditions. There is no middle ground between these demands. There is no way to reconcile between these demands. Therein lies the issue. The connection with speculative theology seems to wane as one gets older. These man-made structures that we build and maintain in our youth begin to disintegrate with age. Chomsky places a spotlight on this disintegration when he discusses the lives of individuals that had invested in their youth in trying to understand the world through these man-made constructs.
Galileo had forged a new model of intelligibility for human understanding, and at the end of his life, his inability to find mechanical explanations for cohesion, attraction, other simple phenomena, it led Galileo to, quote him, to reject the vain presumption of understanding everything. And even worse, he finally concluded, there is not a single effect in nature such that the most ingenious theorist can arrive at a complete understanding of it.
There are multiple accounts of deep regret and anguish from scholars that engage with speculative theology. These accounts are truly moving. Among these accounts are Al-Juwayni's regrets. He lamented that he should have clung to the religion of his mother, or the religion of old women, that simple and modest religion. Perhaps the aging process humbles us. As our minds and our bodies weaken, we realize how uncertain and dependent our lives are. There's an old West Indian saying, once a man, twice a child. When we are born, we are dependent upon others. And when we reach old age, we are again dependent on others, almost childlike. But during the middle period, when we reach manhood, we have the strength of mind and strength of body. We almost forget what it is to be dependent. During this manhood period, we develop these grandiose ideas about ourselves and the world around us. But as we move towards our second childhood, we realize that we have overcomplicated what was simple, and we went searching for something that we always had. All of the models and theories that we have constructed begin to wither away. Only then do we really start to appreciate that we are nothing more than a servant. And the best attitude for a servant to adopt is سمعنا وأطعنا. Even if it goes against our grandiose ideas, we are truly humbled. We also realize that every second spent with the books of Kalam was a second spent away from the book of Allah. Every second that we spent with the words of men was a second spent away from the words of our Lord.